Everything now is being recorded, so please be appropriate. You should be able to find that study guide, like I said, for exam 1 on Blackboard. So just download that and you'll see it opens to this. And so we've got the first 6 chapters coming up in exam 1, which is on Wednesday, September 8th. That exam will be at 8 a.m. You'll come into class and with an electronic device, so your laptop, and you'll log into Blackboard. I'll give you a password to get onto that exam. And once you're finished with that exam, it's 40 questions, multiple choice. You can leave when you're done. Okay, so going through this, I would again like it to be as group orientated as possible. If you have answers, you can put those, shout it out, or go into the group chat. Just make sure you unmute your mic before you answer, or group chat, like I said. Okay, so chapter 1, structure and functions of bodily systems. Understand movements and the muscles involved to produce them. So within that chapter, it goes through the anatomy. That shouldn't be anything new to any of you. So your muscles that produce movements, knowing those as your agonists, knowing the antagonists, the ones that relax when the agonists are contracting to allow the movement to occur. The synergists that assist those movements, a lot of the time that's stabilization. And yeah, and then just know really what, if you have an exercise example, know what's developing that movement. We've covered a few so far within our class time. We looked at the bending lift movements, so mainly on the squat. So know what muscles are active during a squat. Know which ones are the prime movers, your agonists, and which ones are assisting, which ones are just stabilizing. And then that's pretty much that one. Also, all the key terms in the back of the textbook of each chapter, there's a list that would be bold throughout that chapter, listed in the back of each chapter. Make sure you know what each of those are. So you don't have to memorize the whole list, but if you read out agonist, you need to know what an agonist is for that muscle. So make sure you're familiar with all the key terms, you know what they are. And if you read one and you're like, I'm not even sure what that is, go check it out and figure out what that is so that you're aware. So we've got 40 questions to get through. So you're looking at about 7 on each chapter. Know your anatomy, bones, joints, muscles, cardiac and skeletal. So yeah, we talked about it in our classes, your anatomical position, knowing the muscles from there. Know your medical terminology and referring to that anatomical position. So we've talked about medial, lateral, superior, inferior, things of that nature, knowing where one muscle is, so the location, and being able to describe it compared to another muscle's location. So distal, proximal, things like that. Know the muscles that are in the rotator cuff. Okay, we covered that again in our class, but the 4 muscles in that rotator cuff, make sure you're familiar with those and you know which ones will create those movements. Understand processes within a sarcomere during muscle contraction. So again, this comes through, depending on what edition of the textbook you have. Mine that I have is the 4th edition, and page 7 really covers that pretty well. Looking at a sarcomere, looking at your actin and myosin and that cross as they contraction. Knowing, the H lines, the Z lines, the A bands, and how a muscle actually contracts as it gets that nerve impulse, the release of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter through the sarcoplasmic reticulum, getting the excitement of that muscle, and just the actin or the myosin cross-bridging onto the axon and closing that muscle or sarcomere, and so that shortening occurring. Know how that occurs, but that shouldn't be too new to a lot of you. Know the processes and functions of the heart. That's covered in pages 10 through 15. Be able to label a heart, right? You've got 4 chambers. Know the flow of blood through the heart. It starts in the right atrium, right ventricle, goes off to the lungs, comes back, left atrium, left ventricle, goes off to the body. So knowing those chambers, knowing the valves that go through, know where the blood goes, where it becomes oxygenated, where it comes back, and what side is bigger and why, because it's, you know, the left side, because it's pumping through the whole body. So the bigger side of the heart, things like that. How it's the QRS complex, you know, when we look at a heart rate, and when you're in a hospital and you're hooked up to that heart rate monitor, and you can see that QRS complex, understanding what's happening there. Again, there was probably some homework on that, some questions. So being familiar with those, look back on Blackboard at your homework questions. Again, at the end of each chapter, there's some quiz questions. So read through those, make sure you're familiar with those. I did pull a few of those, so that's some easy points that you can get in this exam. So know the chapter questions. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, biomechanics of resistance exercise. The first part is all your levers, right? 3 classes of levers. The majority in the human body are the 3rd class. Okay, so that's where most of our come. For example, on a bicep curl, if we were curling, well, our resistance weight is out here. Okay, then next is our muscular weight, muscular force, and then the fulcrum, okay, is at the end. This is not a very mechanically advantage. It's actually a disadvantage. The fulcrum's at the most posterior, then the muscle that creates the movement, then the resistance weight. For example, and that's what 3rd class is the least mechanically advantaged. Calf raise on the other end, if you look at your calf as you do a calf raise and you calf raise up, that's a different class of lever. You've got your fulcrum at the end, then you've got your resistance weight going up your leg, and then you've got the calf on the back side of the leg to lift up. That giving you a lot of mechanical advantage, giving you a lot more strength, and why you can calf raise many times more weight than you can ever bicep curl. Okay, so it's the type of lever. Understanding those and be able to label the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd type based on the order of where is it pivoting, where's the resistance force, where is the muscle force being generated. Next would be the anatomical positions, planes of movement, planes of motion. Again, we covered this in our human movement class, where we have sagittal, transverse, frontal planes of motion. And then if we were to give it an exercise, understand what plane of motion that is in. So remember, we talked about the planes of glass, and if it could break a plane of glass, if it doesn't break, then it's in that plane. If it does break the glass, then it's not in that plane, and you can understand the movement. Page 26 covers that. The levers are covered on pages 21 through 24. Again, this is the 4th edition book that I have. Power, understanding power. Force is mass times acceleration. So it covered really in page 29, looking at the different power equations, generating power. That's chapter 2. Again, know the key terms at the back of the chapter, know the quiz questions, know your homework questions. If you do that, you'll be in a good position to answer those questions. Chapter 3, bioenergetics of resistance training. And remember to put in the chat, I'll check it in a second because I can't see the chat right now. But put in the chat if you have questions, I'll cover those at the end. Chapter 3, bioenergetics of resistance training. So know your work rest ratios required for the different energy systems. Okay, so this is really covered well in a table on my book. It's page 60, where it looks at, okay, how much work to how much rest do you need? The phosphagen system is the quickest producing energy with ATP, and does require the most time to replenish. So from 1 to 12 to 1 to 20 times as long. Whereas the glycolytic processes and energy systems require a little less time to recover, and aerobic energy production or beta oxidation of fat requires even less, 1-to-1 work ratios. So depending on the intensity of the exercise, the rest associated with that, and it's a ratio. So you may only use the phosphagen system for 10 seconds. So then 12 to 20 times that still isn't very long. Okay, maybe it's just 2-minute break, but it's 12 to 20 times as long as actually what you did for work, versus maybe you can run for 20 minutes and you won't even need that much recovery to do that set again on running. So depending on the energy systems with that work rest ratio. Know the energy systems and the substrates they metabolize and the byproducts they produce. So the 3 energy systems, make sure you're aware of those. Make sure you know the inputs. So phosphagen system is really ATP and ADP. It can be rephosphorylated to create ATP again. You can use creatine to rephosphorylate, and that's really the phosphagen system. Okay, you get some byproducts of hydrogen ions, but it's really not complicated. There's about 2 or 3 equations in that. The glycolytic processes is a lot more. There's 10 different reactions happening there. You've got ATP being produced. You've got byproducts of hydrogen being released, and you get the NAD picking up those hydrogens. You get the end result of pyruvate or lactate if it's quick. Okay, so knowing what's going in and out, and then the aerobic system as it goes furthermore, could be pyruvate going into acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle, could be some amino acids going in there, and it could be fat going in there. Okay, you got more hydrogens being produced, you've got more ATP being produced, FAD is used in the Krebs cycle, as well as NAD for the hydrogen transfer to electron transport chain. So knowing those energy systems, those are covered on pages 44 through 55. So quite a few pages that cover that, but getting a good understanding of how we produce energy. And that goes a long way into understanding nutrition and how we fuel those systems, which is a chapter we come on to later. ATP production from those energy systems that I mentioned just now. You can get ATP being produced in the phosphagen system very quickly through a very small amount of reactions, or you can get ATP being produced a little bit more in volume, but it takes longer through the glycolytic and even more so for the aerobic energy production through Krebs cycle. Knowing how many ATP can be produced. So if for like glycolysis, if one glucose goes through glycolysis rapidly, you get one glucose molecule would have a net production of 2 ATP. It would expend 2 and gain 4 net production of 2. But if it was to go slowly and go through glycolysis to pyruvate and then to the Krebs cycle, then it would go through the Krebs cycle and actually end up creating more ATP through electron transport chain, and you get about 38 ATP out of one glucose. So many more times by doing it slowly than you do it rapidly and getting lactate being produced. So knowing those, again, I think they're covered on pages 53, 55 on, again, the 4th edition textbook. Know the key terms at the back, know the chapter, quizzes, your homeworks on Blackboard. Chapter 4 goes into aerobic exercise. No, endocrine response. Endocrine response. This is a typo. I need to correct this. This should be... All right, apologize for that. So know the glands and the hormones they produce. That's a simple chart there that's listed on page 67. Your adrenals, your pancreas, your thyroid, pituitary gland, your testes, your ovaries, those are all hormone producing glands. So knowing what hormones they produce and then the impact that would have on the body when they are released. So knowing what impact they have, again, I think that's covered on page 67, and then all the way through really to 85 is covering all the different hormones. And then you want to understand, okay, not only what impact do they have on the body, but what can cause their secretion, what causes their release. And really that's to do with stress. The more stress really is going to have more hormone release. Big part growth hormone, cortisol, stress hormone, testosterone. The higher the intensity of the exercise, the more that you are pushing yourself, the more hormone release is generally the theme we'll see with that secretion. Then know how the body reacts to those. Okay, is it anabolic? Is it catabolic? So is it going to build the body tissues more and be beneficial, or is it going to be catabolic and actually start breaking down body tissues? Understanding those will then influence, okay, what training do we do? What type of stress do we want for an athlete? And then you prescribe those exercises and intensities. So cortisol, insulin, IGF-1, progesterone, testosterone, estrogen, growth hormone. Those are all covered in that chapter. So read through those and become familiar with them and understand their role. But again, mainly anabolic, catabolic, it's either going to build, it's going to break down. Those are kind of the things that hormones do. Chapter 5, adaptations to anaerobic exercise. So this is your faster, more intense exercise. Understand the acute and chronic changes in muscle physiology from resistance training. So what things are we going to notice happens when we go through anaerobic exercise? So this is weight training, this is sprints, this is stuff that requires higher intensity, okay? Glycolytic or phosphagen system, okay, not aerobic. And so we get many different changes. Covered pages 31 covers a little bit of the fiber types, and then really going all the way up chapter 5 on page 95 in my textbook, that looks at, okay, fiber changes from type 1, type 2, type 2A, type 2B, and how they adjust based on the stimulus and the stress that they're put under. So you also get increased rate of firing. So your neural drive to muscles can change based on how you're training. The more intense you train, the more neural drive that you send, and the more myelination that neuron gets. So it gets a better connection to that muscle and a higher contraction force. The effect of pennation, which is the angle of fibers. So why a deltoid is very high in force production, but not high in power production. It can be very strong, but often it's slow in its speed. The reason, because it's a wide muscle, but very short. The longer a muscle, the more power it can produce, because when a sarcomere contracts and they're in series, each of them contract, a long muscle can become short, like an elastic band, long, and snap it short. There's a lot of power, you can fly an elastic band. But a short elastic band that's really fat, it's harder to pull apart, it has more force, and it doesn't have as much power. If you were to release it and fly off, it wouldn't go as far as a long, thin band. Same thing with our muscles, okay? Depending on their shape, are they stronger or are they more powerful? Hypertrophy, how that occurs, okay, just that breakdown, micro damage to the muscle cells, then the subsequent repair and an increase in muscle size and force production. Mitochondrial density, it can probably decrease with resistance training. Okay, we're looking at anaerobic training. You're not going to have as much promotion of mitochondrial density. That's more something we're going to see with chapter 6 with aerobic exercise. Muscle fibers and recruitment, we talked a little bit already. So type 1 to type 2 and that transition that can occur in the fiber type by the stress that you put on it, what it's constantly being used. We'll try to encourage that, and the body will adapt and try to use those muscle tissues. Changes in bone formation, okay, this is basically down on intensity of exercise, okay, higher impact, higher intensity exercises, higher force. Actually, when a muscle contracts and pulls onto the tendon, and the tendon is attached to the bone and pulls on the bone, we get this warping of the bone, a force where the bone would want to bend, and it's resisting that bend. That is a stimulus for strengthening that bone. So the more stress, either impact or force from a muscle being pulled on a bone, the more it's going to undergo stress and then adapt to increase bone density and become stronger. So we see increased bone density for weightlifting, gymnasts, for example, that have high impact where they're hitting the floor a lot. You're going to see higher bone density in those athletes. And the opposite would be true for swimmers that have almost no impact and they are floating on the water. Those are going to have very low bone density. And so it's something we can be concerned about with swimmers. So two different extremes there, but everything in between as well, looking at stress and that's put onto the bone. For invincible reversibility and detraining, if you stop training, your body will adapt to that stress. You have very little stress, you'll get weaker. It doesn't need that muscle mass, it will remove it. Okay, your body's constantly trying to keep in homeostasis. So If you create more stress, the body adapts and becomes stronger and fitter. If you create less stress, and which is known as detraining, then your body's going to adapt and become weaker because it doesn't need this extra muscle. It's not using it. It's useless. So the body, again, doesn't think about what's coming in the future. It just responds to the stimulus and the stress you put on it. Know the key words, know the chapter quizzes, know your homeworks on Blackboard. Chapter 6, adaptations to aerobic exercise. Well, look at VO2 max. Understand the acute and chronic changes to muscle physiology with aerobic training. Okay, so mitochondrial density we already mentioned. Okay, that will increase. We'll get more efficiency and more economy with this system. Okay, the more your body uses it and is trying to extract oxygen to create ATP, the better it will get at it. Okay, it's going to extract more oxygen from the air into the blood. It's going to take more from the blood into the mitochondria, and it's going to utilize more and create more ATP with that. If that isn't enough and you still continue to put more cardio stress, there will increase density of those mitochondria. There'll be more in each muscle cell, and then you'll have an increased rate of ATP production, making things feel easier to you. VO2 cardiac output. So cardiac output, the amount of blood being expelled from the heart. Okay. What is that the equation of? QE is stroke volume, the amount of blood being pushed out each beat times the number of beats that you have in a minute. So heart rate. Okay, that is your cardiac output, the amount of blood each minute being pushed out of the heart. These are covered on pages 121 in chapter 6. Table 6.1 is a good use there. And even actually, if you go back to chapter 1 on page 15, it gives you a little bit of detail on the heart as well. But knowing capillary density, lactate concentration, economy and efficiency, which I already mentioned a little bit. Lactate concentration is going to, you're going to have a greater threshold to it, but it's likely to decrease actually lactate formation, because if you're aerobically producing energy, you're not anaerobically producing it. So the more you can get into the aerobic system, the less lactate is actually being produced. Remember, lactate is not dead-end metabolite. You can use that in the liver through gluconeogenesis to create glucose, and it can be used for energy. It's the acid, the hydrogen ions that actually create the fatigue. You get better at dealing with that acid, and that gets buffered out of the cell. But again, the more aerobic training you do, the less lactic acid is actually going to be produced anyway. And those hydrogen ions will be taken to the electron transport chain and produced with combined with oxygen to produce H2O. So that is what our cardio system or aerobic system does. Understanding how the cardiovascular and pulmonary systems function. So understanding breath in, breath out, right? And the taking on of oxygen, the gas exchange that happens in our capillaries, in the small membranes between alveoli and the lungs to the capillaries in our blood, and the exchange of oxygen into the blood and the hemoglobin carrying that. No adaptations that occur aerobically trained individuals. So we kind of already mentioned that. More is written on page 125. Table 6.2 talks about, okay, you know, what happens to your resting heart rate? What happens to your blood pressure as you get more and more trained and become fitter aerobically? Okay, there's many things that occur there. Look at those tables and make sure you're familiar with those changes. But the more you use something, the better it's going to get at it. That's the general theme there, okay? So if it's using it, it's going to get better at using those systems. Resting heart rate, right? It will see that your heart becomes more efficient. So your resting heart rate will actually come down, because that is more efficient. As it sends blood around the body, you can extract the oxygen a lot more easier. So it doesn't have to send as much blood. That means the heart doesn't have to pump as many times. Okay, your heart rate is just a gauge of how much energy you're using. And if you're able to extract more energy per beat because your muscles are actually better extracting them, the mitochondrial density is higher, then the heart rate can come down. So that's just sort of thing you'll see there, but there's many different points actually brought up on page 125. And then know the differences between sexes, okay? Heart size or muscle mass in general. Remember, your heart is a muscle. So a male is going to have a larger muscle and a larger heart size. Know the difference between hormone levels, okay? males have more testosterone, females have more estrogen. So knowing the difference of those hormones and what impact they have, that goes back up to chapter 4 that we've mentioned those hormones. Body fat percentage. Males are going to be leaner, females are going to have slightly higher body fat percentages. What does that mean in for aerobic exercise? Maybe that's a good thing. So that's covered on pages 109 and 110. And that's all of my list, the difference there on through chapters 1 through 6. So I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to go and see if we got any chat questions. This is your chance to put some questions in the chat and I will cover those. Looks like we don't have any right now. I'll give you a chance to put more up here. Otherwise, we'll end our review. Any questions? Okay, you do have about a week where we got 6 days. You got the Labor Day weekend to study. So make sure you get your case study 1 in. That's due Sunday at midnight. And you should already be in your groups by now. If you don't have a group and you don't have a sport, you can't do your case study and you'll have your first homework being late. So make sure that it's all done. Doesn't look like we got any comments, so I'll end this 30 minutes review. Have a great day. Good luck on exam 1. Let me know if you have questions. Send me an email, andy.sykes@wichita.edu. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks.